Chapter 1, 13. Somebody once asked me what my earliest memory was. I've never hesitated with answering that question since I can still recall it with precision and clarity. I was 3 years old, and I only know that in retrospect. I'm pretty sure I wasn't aware of my age at the time. We lived in a small fifth-floor walk-up apartment in the Bronx, and I was trying to get to sleep on a typical hot summer night in the city. The foot of my bed was next to an open window, across from the crib that I had graduated from the year before. The air was very still and hot. The hustle and bustle of the early evening soon settled into the muffled sound of cars and people on the street below. Hours passed, and I was still trying to get to sleep. Mother and father had already turned in, and I lay on my back, looking at the shadows on the walls from the streetlights below. All was quiet. Suddenly, I heard a woman's voice calling out my name. Michael, Michael. I sat up in bed and listened. Again the voice called. Michael, Michael. I thought it might be my mother calling me, but there was no reason why she should be doing that. Plus, she would have come into the room. I waited for the voice to call out again. I looked around the room. Nothing. Silence. Then all of a sudden, there it was. Michael, Michael. It seemed like it was coming from the street below. I crawled over to the open window, afraid to look out, but I did manage a peek. No one was there, only shadows. After a few minutes of waiting for the voice to return and not hearing it anymore, I retreated from the window and tried to get to sleep, but I kept hearing the woman's voice in my head calling to me. I'm not sure if I was surprised, scared, or intrigued, or maybe all three. Eventually I got to sleep, but when I awoke in the morning, I still heard the voice in my head. I may have told my mother or father about this, but I can't remember if I did, or if I did, what their reaction was. All I know is that all these years later, I can still hear her voice in my head, and it still haunts me. But now, I think I may know who she was. Our Bronx apartment was in an Italian neighborhood, and it was noisy with street life and arguments, traffic and kids playing. Italians are loud people, and they live life at maximum volume. My parents were no exception. Both of them were first-generation Italian Americans, with both sets of their parents having been born in Italy. They had been raised in very strict households, and discipline was a key element of their upbringing. They had little patience for mistakes that I may have made as a toddler, whether it was from not eating all my food, to potty training, to not putting my toys away, to just about anything else that was not done correctly. I would get a spanking. These would get worse as I got older, and the old adage of rule by fear seemed to be the way my mother and father parented, inheriting this method from their own parents. I was an only child at this point, but I distinctly remember that one day, after my father had gone to work, my aunt came over to visit. She was all dressed up, and my mother, who was also dressed up, got me in my best clothes and told me we were going somewhere special. When I asked her where, she said we were going to get me a brother. I had no idea what that meant, but my mother and aunt seemed very excited. The three of us left the apartment and went down to the subway. I had never been on one before, and I can still recall the wicker seats and the straps that people held on to if they were standing. The subway car was brown on the outside and cream-colored on the inside, and I thought it was magical that something this big was moving, and it was underground in a tunnel. My mother held on to my hand as we made our way to wherever it was we were going. I'm not sure why my aunt was with us, but I remember she was always nice to me and smiled a lot. We finally got to our stop and went up to the street. My mother looked at my aunt and she turned to me and said, "Are you ready to meet your new brother?" I'm not sure what my response was. I'm not even sure I knew what a brother was. She explained to me that he was going to live with us and I would have a playmate. Being 3 years old, I really had no idea what this all meant, but I do remember her telling me this. We went into a large building with an elevator and went to some kind of office where there were papers to sign in, and then we waited for a while. Then a lady came back with a baby wrapped in a blanket, and she gave it to my mother. After some more discussion, we left, my mother holding the baby in the blanket tight to her chest. She told me this is my new brother. I don't remember looking at him at the time, but my mother and aunt seemed very happy. When we got home, she put him in the crib that used to be mine. I looked at him lying in the crib. He seemed so small. It would take a while before we would become playmates or brothers. My parents named him Robert. I eventually found out that my new brother was about 1 year old. It would take him a little while until he was old enough to be a real playmate. But when he reached about 2 years old, he and I were inseparable. We played cars and trucks and made up games. I can still recall the cars we used to make out of our blankets. We would take our blankets, put them on the floor, and mold them into the shape of a car, complete with doors that opened so we'd get in and drive them around the room. We had quite a bit of fun together, but we would also start sharing the yelling and the beatings that came anytime we did something wrong. By the time I was 5 and my brother was 3, my parents had decided to leave the Bronx and move out to Long Island. Being 5, I had no idea what this meant or what was behind the move, only that our world was being torn upside down. Boxes were being packed and strange people were coming to the house to help move things. I can still remember my mother being really mad at something I did or didn't do during one of these packing days. We were in the lobby of the apartment building and she started yelling at me. To this day, I'm not sure what I did wrong, but what she did next I will never forget. She roughly picked me up, opened up a garbage can, and threw me in and put the lid back on. I was scared and started crying. The smell of garbage was all around me. She told me to shut up or she'd give me something to cry about. I remember crying out, "Let me out, please." I'm not sure how long I stayed in that garbage can, but eventually she took off the lid and let me out. She told me to get into the dumbwaiter and get a box from the kitchen and bring it back down to her. Now, for people who don't know what a dumbwaiter is, or was, it's a small elevator that was used to hoist groceries to upper floor apartments. They usually had a small door that opened into the kitchen. Since there wasn't a people elevator in this building, the dumbwaiter was a convenient way to save yourself the trouble of walking up all those stairs with bundles of groceries. I didn't know that people could ride in them, but my mother told me to get in and bring the box down to her. Being that I was still a pretty small kid, I was able to fit in. She pulled down the cage door and started pulling on the ropes, and I was soon hoisting up. I remember the dark shaft and the cool, dank air inside. All of a sudden, the dumbwaiter stopped. It was really dark. I wasn't sure what had happened. She called up to me and told me to lift the cage door and pushed open the little door that was there, and I would be in the kitchen. I pushed up on the cage door and saw what looked like a door and pushed against it, and opened so quickly I fell out of the dumbwaiter and onto the floor. It really stunned me, and I couldn't move for a minute. I could hear my mother's voice asking me what was taking so long, and did I have the box, and to get back in the dumbwaiter right now. Her voice echoed coming up the shaft. The kitchen was filled with boxes, and I didn't know which one to get. I just picked one out that I could lift, and I put it in the dumbwaiter, but then I realized I couldn't get back in. I tried climbing it, but it was scary to me. I just couldn't do it. Meantime, my mother was yelling up at me, "What's taking so much time? Get moving." I yelled down. I couldn't get in. She yelled that she was coming right up. I didn't know if that meant she would help me or hit me. Turned out she gave me a beating for being so undependable. As usual, I tried to escape and protect myself, but to no avail. My mother's beatings were getting more and more common. My father, on the other hand, was more of the strong, silent type when it came to disciplining me and my brother. Early on, he only yelled when we did something wrong in front of him. His anger was terrifying, and we quickly learned to stay out of his way. Usually that wasn't too difficult, since he was at work all day, and at night he preferred to eat dinner and watch some television. But my mother was around all day, and she was really hard to please. It always seemed that anything we did, she'd find fault with it. Robert and I would always pay with some kind of beating. At these times, I was glad I had a brother. It would have been even worse had I been alone. We finally moved out to the new house on Long Island. I remember it being down a long road, and the house had pink and gray aluminum siding with a lot of trees in the backyard. Robert and I shared a bedroom like before. Since I was 5 years old, I'd be starting kindergarten in the fall. Robert and I both went to the local elementary school at the end of that long road. Of course, he had to wait until he was 5 to start. My father had bought a car so that he could commute to his job in the city. It was a new experience to drive in a car. It was a big, blue, used 1953 Oldsmobile built like a tank. Living out in the suburbs took some getting used to. Gone was all that city noise, the smells of all the cooking from the different apartments, the constant traffic on the streets below, the kids playing on the steps of the buildings. Now it was eerily quiet. You could hear birds and sometimes animals in the woods behind the house. My father left every day to go to work, and my mother was left alone in the house after my brother and I left for school. I had no idea what she'd do all day. Now I realize it was cleaning and cooking and watching daytime TV. What I do know is that she had it in for me and Robert when we came home from school. We both had chores to do, and if we didn't do them correctly, we'd get beat pretty good. Several times I'd have marks on me that I'd have to hide so the other kids wouldn't see them and ask me what happened. It was too embarrassing to say that my mother hit me. Even when we thought we had done a good job with our chores, there was usually something wrong we had to pay for. The years passed, and I was now about to finish up 6th grade. I was learning algebra, a new requirement in math, and doing pretty good in all my classes. I loved reading and often lost myself in books whenever I could. Usually I had a book by my bedside that I would read before going to sleep. I was developing into a student who really enjoyed learning new things. Robert, on the other hand, was doing just enough to get by. I was amazed at how different we were in that regard. But he had become my best friend and a great person to play around with. After spending 6 years in that small house and making some friends at the school, my parents decided once again to move to a larger house. My father had recently gotten a job on the island, so he wouldn't have to make the long commute into the city. He'd also gotten a new car, and the time seemed ripe for another big change in all our lives. So we moved to a new house, in a new town, with a new car and a new job. Robert would be starting 5th grade at the new elementary school, and I would start 7th grade in the junior high school. It was a difficult transition, having left my friends and the safety and familiarity of the old school and the established routine Robert and I had worked out. Everything was new and felt foreign. But, like most things, time allows for all that to settle down to a somewhat manageable routine, and me and Robert eventually made new friends and found the new neighborhood welcoming enough. Of course, with all the newness, some things remained the same. My parents had become less patient with us, and it seemed we couldn't do anything right. If I got a B in class, it was always, "Why isn't it an A?" Our chores were never done to their satisfaction, which usually resulted in getting hit or punished, or both. Somehow, Robert and I survived, but it seemed like it was getting worse. I was getting tired of all the bruises and being hurt all the time. There was one day in particular where I was vacuuming the floors, and it seemed I had missed some dust under the sofa. My mother started yelling at me for not doing a good job, and I told her it must have just rolled under there, but I'd get it right away. She said, was I calling her a liar? I said, no, I just cleaned under the sofa and there was no dust under it. I had recently begun to develop a sense of correcting injustices, and me talking back to my mother to correct misinformation was my way of letting her know that I was on top of it and she should just let me finish my dusting. Well, that didn't sit well with her, and she ripped the vacuum cleaners out of my hand and swung them at my head. The end of the pipe caught me right behind my ear and sent me sprawling. I was more shocked than anything else, despite a small cut which started to bleed. I must have screamed out something because she yelled at me to shut up and get out of her sight. I ran out of the room as fast as I could. I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. I was 13, Robert was 11, and we were both thinking it couldn't get much worse. Most of the beatings came from my mother, and we both thought she was like Jekyll and Hyde. One minute seeming to be normal, especially when the neighbors stopped by, and the next minute an angry, violent maniac. My father usually didn't hit us unless it was something pretty serious, but those times were downright scary. There was one time when Robert and I both had done something against their wishes. I think it was taking our bikes out for a ride without their permission. We had just gone to bed and he burst into the room, running to my bed. Scared to see my father so enraged, I sat up in bed and cowered against the wall. He was yelling at the top of his lungs and turned red in the face. He raised his arm and his fist came speeding right towards my head. I'm not sure how I did it, but I managed to move my head just enough to make him miss, and his fist came crashing through the wall with such force it went right through the sheetrock and hit the plywood siding of the house. I remember thinking, that could have been me. After seeing the hole in the wall, he started cursing and yelling some more and then left the room. My brother and I were both shaken. We had oddly gotten used to our mother's daily beatings, but the infrequent outbursts by my father were not only frightening, but dangerous as well. Then one day, after the dinner dishes had been washed and put away, my father went to do some work outside, and my mother called me and Robert into the kitchen and told us to sit down. We both wondered what was going on, but we did as we were told and just sat down. My mother looked at both of us and said we were very special and she loved us very much. Robert and I looked at each other in disbelief but said nothing. What she said next, though, would stay with me forever. She explained that she and my father had always wanted children, but that she was unable to have any, and that we were both adopted. I think I may have heard about adoption somewhere, but didn't really know much about it. All of a sudden, here it was, staring at me in the face. What did this mean? Was she our real mother? If she wasn't, where was my real mother? I wanted to ask these questions, but I was too afraid. She told us that we were both a gift and that she wanted to tell us about where we came from before we got much older. Where we came from? Now I wanted to know about my birth mother and where she was, and why she gave me up for adoption, and how old I was when all this happened. But my mother didn't offer any other information, only that we were better off where we were now. Better off? Robert and I both looked shocked. How could getting put down and beat on every day be better off? The meeting finally ended and it was now bedtime. Robert and I whispered in our beds. What did this all mean? In some strange way, we both felt betrayed by our real parents. Who were they and why did they abandon us? How could we find them? And how did we end up with the parents we had now? So many questions and no answers. To this day, those questions still linger, and very few answers have been revealed over the years. We eventually fell asleep, but it was the sleep of someone who, upon awakening, would look at the world very differently. I had always been told that I was Italian, and everyone in the family was Italian, of course. But now I began to doubt that, and I recalled how some of my Jewish friends had mentioned to me that I looked Jewish. I wondered if I came from Russian or Eastern European parents. I could be from anywhere, anyone. In a very strange way, this new knowledge was very liberating, and I soon found myself trying on the nationality of many different kinds of people, playing with my identity, seeing which ones fit better than others. Meanwhile, my brother Robert kept a lot of his thoughts to himself, until one day when he didn't come home from school. My parents asked me if I had seen him at school, but since we were in different grades, I usually never ran into him at school, although we sometimes came home together. This day I just assumed he walked home with some of his friends. My father was still at work, so my mother started asking around if they had seen Robert. Nobody had seen him. She called the school and they told her that he had not been at school that day. Now she was getting worried. She questioned me again and threatened me I'd better tell the truth or I'd get punished. I told her again I hadn't seen him. I didn't know where he could be. She called the mothers of his friends, but none of them had seen him either. Now it was getting serious. I thought to myself that Robert had taken the drastic step of running away. I had no idea he was planning on doing this, but I secretly hoped he would succeed. Of course, with me being only 13 years old, I had no clue how he was supposed to survive on his own, but I wanted him to escape the life we were both living. My mother was really agitated by now, and she called my father at work, telling him what was going on. He told her to call the cops, and he'd be home as soon as he could. So the cops had called, and they came to the house asking questions, and they asked for a recent picture of Robert. They finally left and went on their way. Meanwhile, the neighbors were all very curious about what was going on, having seen the cop car at our house and the commotion inside. Several of them came to visit and offer advice or to sit with her to await my father's arrival. I just hung back, staying quiet, not knowing what to do or what to think. I went to my room to do some homework, but my mind kept thinking about where Robert was and if he was okay. Afternoon turned into evening. My father finally came home and everything that had been done was told to him. He asked me what I knew about this, and I told him the truth. I knew nothing about it. The neighbors had gone, and we had a very quiet dinner, our first without Robert. Then, at about 8 p.m., the doorbell rang. Outside was a cop car, and I could see from the window that 2 cops were escorting Robert up the front steps to our house. They had found him. My parents were very grateful to the cops for finding him. They told him that they had found him in the next town over, walking the streets alone. They matched him up with the photo my mother had given them and picked him up. After the cops left, my father started yelling at my brother and took him into the bedroom to give him a beating, telling him he had better think twice about ever doing that kind of stunt again. I felt bad for Robert. Here he was trying to escape this kind of a treatment, and he had just fallen right back into it. I talked to Robert about what he did, where he went, how he was feeling. He seemed defiant, angry, and upset that the cops had found him. But being only 11 years old, I'm not sure he had many options for success. I, on the other hand, decided to take all of what he had told me and make a plan for my own escape. I decided instead of going to school, I would leave early in the morning like Robert did. That would give me a head start of at least 6 hours before anyone would raise suspicions of me missing. So a month later, I took some allowance money I had saved, and with my lunch bag, I set out as if I was going to school. I often walked alone, and I took a path through the woods that no one else liked to take, so I wouldn't be missed by anybody. I walked out to the main highway out of town and started hitchhiking. It wasn't long before I got picked up by a young guy who was going to a college a few towns over. He asked me where I was going, and I had to think for a minute. I actually had no plan, no real idea where I could go or should go. I told him I was visiting some friends out in Ronkonkoma. This was one of the few towns I knew about because my father had a friend there, and the college would get me a good chunk of the way there. It was a pretty good distance from our house, and I was glad for the ride. He didn't ask me about my age or anything else, and I was glad not to have to answer any questions about that. He let me out at the entrance of the college, and I started hitchhiking again. No one was picking me up, so I just started walking and walking. I must have been walking for at least 2, maybe even 3 hours, sticking to the side of the road. I was on a major 4-lane road in a mostly residential neighborhood. I came to a stretch of woods where I decided to go into the trees and eat my lunch. I sat down with my back up against a tree and ate my sandwich. I had no idea what time it was, but it seemed like at least early afternoon. I started thinking about what I was going to do, how far away from home I could get, where I was going to sleep that night. Long Island is about 120 miles long and looks a bit like a fish. As I started walking again, I saw signs for Riverhead, which is the town at the point where the tail of the fish splits. I knew this was a long way from home. I began to get really concerned about darkness setting in and not knowing what to do. I was all alone walking along this highway, trying to keep to the sidewalks, making it look like I was just a kid on his way home. I stopped into a candy store. I had some money on me and thought I'd buy a Coke to drink and maybe some candy bars. I looked at the clock and there it was already 5 o'clock. I got my Coke and a Drake's ring ding and I left, wondering what to do. I was beginning to get scared. On the one hand, I didn't want to return home and have to put up with the daily beatings. But on the other hand, I was smart enough to realize I wasn't equipped to stay out on the streets for too long. After meandering around for a bit, I decided I had to go back home. I returned to the highway and started walking towards home. The only way I was going to get home before it got really late was to hitchhike again, so I stuck out my thumb, and about 10 minutes later, I was picked up by a bunch of long-haired guys and girls all crammed into a Volkswagen Beetle. Somehow they squeezed me in and asked me where I was going. I told them, and they said, "Oh, you're a long way from home, but we're going past it. We can take you there." They were playing some loud rock music. Everyone was talking and smoking. I felt really out of place, and I didn't say much at all, but they were very curious about what I was doing all this way out on the island. I told them I had run away, but that I was returning home. They seemed to be glad to help me out, and after driving for what seemed like an hour, we got to an intersection that was only a couple of blocks from the house. I asked them what time it was. They said about 11:30. I got out and thanked them and started walking home. As I turned the corner and started walking down my block, I could see cars parked outside the house. As I got closer, I recognized cars from my relatives. I could hear voices coming out into the street, and my head began to get really light. I felt like I was not in control of my body. I was just walking on automatic. I walked up the front steps. I could hear voices inside the house, some uncles and aunts, my grandparents, and my parents. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and walked in. There were shouts of surprise and shock and then welcoming. Everyone was asking me if I was okay. My mother quickly took one look at me and told me to wash up and that she'd heat me up some soup. My aunt and uncle gave me a hug. It seemed like everyone was breathing a sigh of relief. My father just looked at me and was about to say something, but my mother gave him that look that said, "Later." I figured I was in for a beating after everyone had left. Eventually, everyone did leave, and my mother asked me where I went and how I got there. I told her what had happened. My father wanted to know why I did it and was I copying what Robert did just to see if I could do it. I told him that I ran away because I was scared to live there and I didn't feel like I belonged there, being that they weren't my real parents. I think that really shook them, and my mother told me they loved me and Robert very much and that we shouldn't feel that we were not wanted. I wasn't sure if I should believe that, but I didn't want to say anything more but just go to bed. So after finishing my soup and brushing my teeth, I went to bed. I thought Robert would be asleep, but he told me he hadn't really gone to sleep at all and was listening to all the conversations, especially the ones between our mother and father. He told me he didn't buy any of what they said and that nothing was going to change. I hoped he would be wrong, but sadly he wasn't. I would start high school in another year, and I was thinking that maybe I could start looking for my birth parents. My favorite aunt lived close by, and I remember that she was the one who accompanied my mother to get my brother on the subway all those years before. I asked her about that a few years later. She said that I was in an orphanage and was adopted when I was about a year and a half old. She didn't really know anything about my birth parents except that they were Italian. And then she said something I've never forgotten. She said that she was pretty sure my father was in jail and that my mother had to put me up for adoption because she couldn't raise me by herself. All of this raised more questions than it answered, but that's all my aunt could tell me. Years later, after I graduated college, I began to search in earnest for my birth parents, but everywhere I turned for answers, I was met with dead ends. I searched in the Mormons' Directory of Births in the U.S., which is a very exhaustive listing of every birth in the country. I registered with 23andMe, Ancestry.com, the New York Public Library, the New York Bureau of Vital Statistics, and anywhere else that could give me some clues. I was told that all my birth records had been destroyed in a fire. After inquiring about this fire, I found out that this is an excuse that agencies tell you when they can't or won't release information if the court records are sealed. Undaunted, I kept trying, working on social media and the internet, but without much success. The closest I got was many years later when my father passed away in Florida, where they had moved to. My mother had been dead for nearly 20 years, and my father's passing prompted my brother, who lived near them, to go through papers in his dresser when he came across my adoption documents. He mailed them to me, and when I opened and read them, I just stopped and stared. There, on this official form, was the name of the adoption agency and my birth last name. Still no name for my birth mother and father, but there was my given birth name, Michael Anthony Fonte. I just stared at it. It's difficult even now to describe that feeling of being lost and somehow found, even if it was just the tiniest sliver of daylight in this lifetime of shadow. So now I had a last name to go on, but in the ensuing years it has only led to one dead end after another. I did manage to call someone who could have been my father or uncle or some such relative, but he was very elderly and his son didn't really want me to talk to him. Another time I contacted someone who was a very close DNA match to me from Ancestry.com. She said she could have been my half-sister. We tried to figure out the family connection, but nothing added up, and I just had to let it go. Each time I would get my hopes up, only to be disappointed again and again. Meanwhile, my brother Robert had miraculously been contacted by a woman who said she was his birth mother. He was now living in New Jersey and working and living on his own. He told me she had been tracking him down for a few years and reached out to him for a meeting. They finally did meet, and he found out she was indeed his birth mother and that he came from a German family. I always knew he didn't look Italian at all. He had 2 sisters in Connecticut and an extended family in the New England area. When he told me this, I was so happy for him. I asked him when he was going to meet everyone in his new family. Surprisingly, he said he didn't want to meet any of them. I asked him why not. He said he really didn't want to start up with a new family at this time in his life. The family he had was going to be good enough for him. I thought he was crazy, especially since his birth mother had spent so long searching for him, only to be turned away now. I wished I was able to be found like he was. And then I thought of that voice so long ago at the bedroom window. Michael, Michael. All these years later, I realized who it was. It was my mother calling out to me. She knew I was living in that apartment and only wanted to see me, if only for one last time. I wish I could have called out to her and to look out that window to see her. It would have been a memory to last a lifetime.